Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Atossa Abrahamian.
Atossa. Thank you very much for being here. This is our first time chatting. It might be our only time, who knows? But I'm
Who knows?
excited that we're talking, and I really appreciate your making time. And I wanted to ask you to start things off. What's currently happening with you? What are you thinking about? What's holding you back? What's dynamizing you? What's interesting you?
Yeah, so I think the only way to stay sane is to stay interested, right, given what's going on in this country. And so I'm trying to be interested. And it's not it's not all that hard because on some level, all the things that President Trump is saying, have been things that I've been thinking about and writing about as a journalist for, coming up on a decade and a half. But
Mm.
at this, and we'll get into that, but at the same time, I'm also kind of worried about what my future looks like in this country, what my children's future looks like in this country. What used to be a sort of vague, at least I have foreign citizenship, I have a plan B, is more concrete now. And can I retire in this country someday? Will I be able to buy health insurance? So pretty dark and like administrative things are keeping me up at
Yes. No, and with good reason. I feel the same way. Like you, I have an accent.
night.
So I became a US citizen, and I wonder, should I go back there to live, which is probable. I'm actually moving to Mexico tomorrow from Spain, where I currently live. That's if Mexico still exists tomorrow. It might be called America. Who knows? I wonder about whether all those things will happen. Will I still be a citizen? Will this be something as a status that is taken away from foreigners? What happens about retirement, social security? What happens about healthcare? So these are very concrete things, and especially for people from other countries, such as ourselves, but I mean, just as notably for local people, right? What is
Yep.
there for people who've, along with their families, you know, people of Chicano or Mexicano origin whose families might have been there for 500 years, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's really dizzying. And it's I'm working on a story now that was initially going to be a reaction to Trump's announcement that he's going to start, well, he's raising the price of green cards to $5 million and calling them gold cards. And at first I thought, well, I tell myself every time something like this happens, this is the last article I'm going to write about passports because I've written many. I wrote a book
Yes.
about it, and I'm a little bit sick of talking about it. But, this is the time. But then at the same time, I can't complain about, oh, I've been screaming into the void and no one listens. And then when someone's listening, I have to take the advantage of the moment. So I am writing what I hope will be my final passport story. And it started off as a reaction to this gold card
Yeah.
and now executive order. And what it's turning into is actually a piece about how Trump has it backwards. The majority of this plurality of people trying to get a second residence or citizenship are Americans. This is according to the consultants that help arrange these transactions. And 10 years ago, this would have been unheard of. And now look at where we are. It's just so interesting from an industry perspective and from a geopolitical one too.
Tusa, I can't tell you I'm getting all these marriage proposals from women in the United States who just some other passport. Actually,
Oh,
not.
it's because of your good looks and your boyish charm.
That must be it. But in all seriousness, when we look at the history of the passport and how recent it is in certain ways, and its formalization is very recent, it's amazing how, and your work illustrates this so brilliantly and perspicaciously, this object has become, to use the word gold, a gold standard, when really it was terribly arbitrary and flimsy and almost nothing, right? If
Yeah.
you go back a little way and spin most of the world.
Yeah, and it's become a lot more digital and sort of indelible. You can't, it's a lot harder to get a fake passport now with all the biometrics and stuff. But actually, this brings me to another thing I was thinking about. There was and recently a number of transgender people have been coming out and saying, I applied for a new passport. It's come back with not my gender marker, not how I identify. So if they were born assigned female at birth, then transition, lived for a long time, even had passports that were male, now are seeing them being reverted back against their wishes. And people think of passports as being part, somehow an extension of themselves. Like, this is my passport. We say it's my passport. I've lost my passport. But if you flip to the, not the front page, but back further in the back in the passport, it says in no uncertain terms, this is the property of the US government. That's the case for most passports. So they don't even really belong to us. We've just kind of been tricked into thinking so. But it's actually like, what could be more illustrative of the tendency that passports are a tool of the state, right? They're not even ours. Um, and I think that's important to keep an eye on because we tend to forget that.
No, absolutely. One of the things that happens to me every time I'm coming back to Spain, which, as I say, I'm leaving tomorrow, I'm very much challenged by the border officials as to whether I'm allowed to be here. And I just become an arrogant American and they let me in. And off to one side are Latin American footballers who like me, have a contract to work here, but are from Latin America and so can't be arrogant gringos. And
Mhm.
so the interesting thing is, I think, of course, they are property of the state, but they also have something inherent within them about a certain kind of nationalism. And one of the topics you've written about is, I guess, the possibility of an end to the sovereign state or a problematization of the nation. And I wonder if you could talk to us a wee bit about that.
Yeah, I think maybe this is a bit of an overstatement as to the longevity of the nation state. I think it's here to stay. But I think that the nation state has sort of enlisted all kinds of extraterritorial entities to advance its interests. So my most recent book is called The Hidden Globe, and it's about all of these places that don't quite fit on the map. Oceans, outer space, special economic zones, warehouses that are outside customs territory, all these places that we think of when you think about them in the context of the world map, just, the nations and the colors and all, they don't entirely adhere to this idea of, one land, one law, one set of people, one government, because it's a sort of different regime. But on the other hand, they're just extremely useful to nations and to nationalists, right? Because they allow them, both the nations and the nationalists, individuals, to maintain this sort of mythology of the strong borders and these, distinct containers that we call countries or nations, while also benefiting from all of the international trade that might help a nation sustain itself these days. Um, they are also sites of some pretty nefarious activity. Offshore detention sites are increasingly popular way of quote unquote managing migration flows, quote unquote. I hate
Mhm.
these terms. Basically, they're just being third countries or third spaces like Guantanamo are being used to warehouse asylum seekers. And I think that that's really interesting too in the context of the global tax regimes, right? Because we have all of these tax havens that people use because they can't do that at home, right? They'll send their money to Cayman or they'll send their money to some other place to
Or
benefit,
the city of London.
or the City of London to benefit from a jurisdictional or from a set of rules that they wouldn't be able to take advantage of from where they're sitting or where their money is sitting. And this is kind of a similar mechanism, right? You can't mistreat people so blatantly on, in the like within the confines of US soil or UK or what have you, but you can find another place where you can get away with all
Oh,
kinds.
yeah. Now, the subtitle of this very notable book of yours is How Wealth Hacks the World.
Mhm.
one of the things that a lot of people in the EU are saying, uh, in terms of Ukraine and other issues, is that we, in inverted commas, should just take all these sequestered Russian funds and use them to rearm, as if this were the run up to a Second World War. That's very interesting in terms of using a kind of reserve power of the state. And on the one hand, I see your work as telling us the state owns you per the passport and its last pages. On the other, the state is a tool of capital. Have I got that right, or am I misconstruing things?
No, it's pretty much accurate. I mean, the state creates the laws that allows capital to be created and preserved at the most basic level, or allows for jurisdictions to emerge that create the laws that create the wealth that, preserve the wealth. So, you got to start somewhere. A lot of what I write about is sort of abstract and deterritorialized, but it all does have to come down to earth at a certain point. And on earth, we have very entrepreneurial jurisdictions like Luxembourg, like Switzerland, like Nauru, even totally different contexts here. But yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. Now, what's really interesting about this proposal to just take the seized assets and use them to rearm, or another one to rebuild Ukraine, is I thought that was impossible to do. I thought you couldn't just take all that money. I thought that it had to go through processes or was locked up and just couldn't be touched. There's so much of that money floating around. I mean, in Switzerland, billions are just kind of suspended in midair
Mhm.
in the banks because no one really knows how or what to do with the seized funds from foreign dictators. So I will be really interested to see if this is a political
Can really happen.
possibility.
Well, when people of my generation, when we were young, the sexiest thing you could do was to get a numbered Swiss bank account.
Hmm.
And you actually go back, 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 as they say in baseball commentary, I think to the 13th century. And the Swiss really are the fons et origo of a lot of what you're discussing in that book, aren't they?
That's what I think. The Swiss were very, I used the word entrepreneurial earlier, but again, very entrepreneurial as a nation or as
Mm,
cantons, I guess, at
mm,
the time,
mm.
in realizing they didn't have a whole lot going for them, but what they could do is be very useful to their neighbors.
Right.
And what that means now is, something very different. In the 20th century, it meant being a tax haven. In the 12th century or 13th century, it meant providing mercenaries for the French king or, later for the East India companies. So it is a type of entrepreneurialism. It's fundamentally kind of a mercenary mindset, right? Uh, and it endures to this day. Now they have a lot of copycats, and I think that this Swiss model of nationhood of doing business has become really common, and it's everywhere you look, there it is. But yeah, it's I think the Swiss kind of ethos is really undervalued, or I guess under appreciated on the world stage.
Um, Going back prior to that, to your first book about citizenship, and I know in a way you're tired of this, but you feel as though you
Okay.
also can't leave it behind. Tell us a little bit about that. Because when I was, I guess, trying to work through some of these ideas about citizenship, people used to deride this as an absurd concept by contrast with women or the working class or other oppositional fronts, that it was a reactionary category. I guess I think you've got a slightly more subtle take on it, but I'd be interested to know, looking back on that book from what, 5, 10 years,
And
10,
yeah.
how are you seeing citizenship now as opposed to when you wrote it?
So when I wrote The Cosmopolites, I was sort of on a mission to show how absurd citizenship is. That was my main goal. Like, we are so bound up with these ideas about citizenship, but what is it really?
Yeah.
And what will really reveal the absurdity of this institution. And what I landed on was the fact that many countries were just selling their citizenship to rich people without even requiring so much as a visit to their country, often island countries and often former colonies, which becomes significant, I think, at a certain point. But so when I wrote this book, and I wanted to do two things. I wanted to show how absurd it was, and I wanted to show it how it was this institution was revealing its absurdity, both in the sort of 1% and also
Mm,
among people who had really very few resources.
mm,
So
mm.
the passport market for the rich people was an obvious way to show, look, citizenship is absurd because you can buy it, and how much can it possibly mean? Of course, I say all of this knowing well that it means a great deal to most people, right? We're not all buying and selling and renouncing our passports. And yet, so there's the high end, all of these conferences where rich people go and figure out what passport they're going to buy. And then there's the bargain basement level, as I call it, which is that the world is also full of stateless people who are deprived of citizenship. And this market mentality has led to the point where in the 2008, but starting in 2008, the United Arab Emirates bought for their stateless people who have essentially always lived in the United Arab Emirates, bought them passports from a third country, from the Comoro Islands. It's a pretty cool story. I'm not going to spoil it for you, um, for the listeners. There's sort of an element of intrigue. But how did we get here, right?
Mm,
That
mm,
not
mm.
only is it being bought by individuals, but bought for people, sometimes against their will. Like nobody asked for this. Um, and so that's kind of where the institution is now, except
Yeah.
when I was writing, this was still, I guess, mildly shocking to most people. And now we have President Trump sitting in the Oval Office, passing an executive order, essentially doing something very similar, which is selling access to his country's green card and fast track to citizenship. So we've really, it's accelerated in a way that even makes my head spin. I really didn't see this coming.
True, although about 30 years ago, my recollection is that Rupert Murdoch, when he bought all these TV networks,
Hmm.
was given citizenship in 10 days in order to satisfy Federal Communication Commission rules. Um,
Yeah.
Now, before we get on to your book that's about to come out, I guess, or forthcoming book. Yeah.
So it came out in the UK. It just came out in America. It came out in October. So it's
Oh, my apologies. Okay,
yeah, that's
great.
okay.
All right. Recently out, which I've not read, I must admit. I don't have a copy, but I did read some of the things that I guess come from it. Before we get on to talking about that, I wondered if just for a moment you could reflect in very general terms on what it's like to be a journalist who isn't writing summations of the weather or box scores from Dodgers Stadium about baseball, but is doing long form journalism.
Mm.
Something that many of us think can be the salvation of journalism in the current crisis, but obviously is risky, costly, labor intensive, and, frankly, in many ways, sometimes perilous, but certainly precarious for journalists, for
Yeah,
reporters.
it's no way to make a living. I've managed through a combination of fellowships, good luck, book advances, and maybe most importantly, a spouse with health insurance,
Ah,
job.
that's good. Yeah.
So that's, full disclosure. I'm not going it completely alone. And yeah, I mean it's a great way to spend your time, but it's also not a sure thing. And now that I'm done with this book, I'm kind of trying to figure out what the next thing is going to be. And it might not be full-time long form journalism. In fact, that seems pretty unlikely. But it's a great racket.
I mean, I hardly think it's a racket. I think it's something incredibly admirable. So I'm sorry that you had to correct me about the fact that the book is already out.
Oh,
My
that's
sincere
okay.
apologies. Could you tell us about it? Because as I say, I've read at least one long form piece that I think relates to it.
Yeah, so the Hidden Globe is an exploration of places outside our nation state system. I say outside, they're actually very much part of it, but they
Hmm.
don't quite fit. So the book starts in Switzerland, as we discussed, and ends in Switzerland. Actually, well, it begins in Geneva, which is where I grew up, and it ends in the high Arctic. And along the way, we go to a bunch of different jurisdictions that are both of the state and outside it. So one example is the Dubai International Financial Center. Um, this is a free economic zone in Dubai, in the nation of UAE, United Arab Emirates. But this free zone, which is essentially a real estate development, has its own court. And it's a story of how it came up, how this happened, how this court sort of came up out of nowhere. And the man who helped put it on the map, an Englishman named Mark Beer. And I thought that was an interesting chapter. I really struggled with the chapter because it's hard to make these things interesting. Like what? But just on a fundamental level, I think it illustrates that law is not something that is like, it doesn't just come from the soil, it doesn't drop from the sky. It's a bunch of decisions that people make. And then they make a court. Like it's kind of fake. It's really weird. It's not really what we think of as the law. And yet courts can be just made up. They require some approvals. Um, but then what happens if this court is sort of outside the national system? What does that represent? That's one example. I also have a chapter about space law and outer space. And that's told through this law that Luxembourg passed to legalize and recognize property rights in outer space. Um, Sounds like Star Trek or something, but it's totally real. And actually, I link that to Luxembourg's long history of creating loopholes for capitalists. So Luxembourg, like Switzerland, was an early adopter of financial secrecy and shell company laws that
Mhm.
exempted companies from certain types of taxes. And while the clientele for these holding companies was that Belgian dentists. That was the stereotype. It was sort of dentists from neighboring countries who wanted to not pay the full amount
Yeah.
of tax averse upper middle classes. Now it's asteroid miners from Silicon Valley, like Elon Musk types, who might want to benefit from a legal stability, the legal stability that such a law will offer. So there's no point in mining an asteroid if no one's going to recognize the gold that you find as yours. And that's kind of the calculus.
John Locke rules, right? I mean,
Exactly. They talk about John Locke all the
I'm
time.
sure, no, of course. I really enjoyed your article in The Guardian that I guess is part of one chapter, probably, of this book
A recent one about Jean Ziegler.
about Jean
That's
Ziegler.
that's correct. Yeah,
Um,
it's the
and
first chapter.
is it okay?
It's part adapted, yeah.
Okay, yeah. It really turned me on because I like reading about old leftists who've not given up the cause, I guess. He just reads like he's kind of a curmudgeon but adorable.
Yeah. He's a really sweet guy. You can tell I mean, he's a bit of a broken record. Like he's been repeating a lot of the same bits for like decades now. But I think that in a place like Switzerland, it's unbelievably brave. Like yes, Switzerland is a free, like you can say what you want. It's not a dictatorship by any stretch. But the norms and the sort of mores of the Swiss are quite rigid. And for someone to come out and speak out against the banks, in the 60s and 70s is so radical.
Yeah, yeah. And I wondered if I could ask you a slightly personal question about this. On
Yeah.
your website that I visited, you list, I think, four citizenships. And I'm very envious because I've only got three and mine are all boring. But can you tell us a little bit about how you have those citizenships and how that does or doesn't facilitate working life?
hmm Yeah. So the reason I have four is, well, it's absurd too. When I was conceived, my parents had only Iranian papers, and they were living in Switzerland. which does not grant citizenship upon birth. You have to live there, you have to paperwork, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Um, and on top of that, even if Switzerland had granted me citizenship upon birth, I wouldn't have been eligible because my father was working for the UN he wasn't a diplomat, but he was in a high enough position that he had diplomatic status. So just license plates on his car. Anyway, so Switzerland, being born with an Iranian passport in 1986, was not a great thing for for me, not a great way to start your life, you know?
No.
Um, and so my parents kind of thought, you know, what can we do? How can we get our child out of this
Yeah.
prison?
Right.
And they had family. My mother's family was in Canada, so off she went to Canada. She was very small, so she wore a big coat. No one noticed she was pregnant. So I was born in Canada, a country I've been to maybe 5 or 6 times since that day. I do have family there. My brother, she did the same for my brother, and he moved there, and he's a law-abiding, tax-paying
So every
resident of
time your mom
Montreal.
was pregnant, she went to Canada. I love this.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And
he's the real deal. He's interested in the National Hockey League and all of
not
that.
quite, but
And you are just what Stalin called a rootless cosmopolitan.
yeah, I'm the worst Canadian who ever existed. And actually, right now in front of me, I have a stack of papers because I'm determined to get my children Canadian citizenship, and they are in fact eligible for it. But it's a bit of a pain in the butt to do it. So that's where the Canada comes from.
Right.
I lived in Switzerland for long enough my father passed away with my mother who became Swiss and I became Swiss. So, and that made sense. We did live there. I did live there for 18 years, right? So I
Mm,
feel a little bit more connected to that one.
mm.
Then when I was 18, I moved to the US and went through a whole series of student visas and post-student visas and artist visas and yada, yada, yada. I also married an American and I got my citizenship here in 2022. So everyone said, "Oh, congratulations." And I said, I know too much to be happy about this, both about the citizenship thing and about America, but I'm glad I did it. And so here we are.
Well, next year, as you know, the World Cup of men's football is going to be in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. On the one hand, we have a president, the orange combover, and his little pal, the man-child, who was instrumental in getting the World Cup to be there when he was last president. On the other, what's he going to do if Iran qualifies for the World Cup final? With Iranians coming into the country, what's he going to do, given that Mexico is a co-host, with Mexicans coming into the country? Not just football players, but fans as well, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to be one of these things where his narcissism and egoism match or don't match, right? His ideological base. I mean,
Can I make a wacky prediction? So I think that for people like Iranian footballers and foreign fans, I think that they're going to come up. I think that they're actually going to give them visas, but they're not going to be able to leave the city that they arrive in. And I say that, and I have reason to say this because my mother, for a time, was working in the UN in New York as an Iranian because that was her sort of nationality under which she was hired. She lived in New York for 3 years, and she wasn't allowed to leave a 10-mile radius of Midtown. These were the terms under which Iranians were allowed to be here. And I would not be surprised if the World Cup being in the US led to some kind of absurd situation where you can go to LA or you can go to New Jersey or wherever, but you really just the stadium is where you can be.
I
You
mean, we
have to get
shouldn't laugh, but I mean, and I think this also exposes one other thing, and I know you have to leave in a minute or two, which is that there is a critical position about the current conjuncture that says actually this is just the US with gloves off being more honest. That a
Mm.
lot of what Trump is doing is actually not that different from Obama or Clinton or Biden. Do you have a take on that?
Yes and no. I mean, there's definitely precedent, and Biden didn't throw everything that Trump did the first time out at the window. So there's continuity and there's precedent. This does feel different. It just doesn't seem right to say this is more of the same, just more. There's something qualitatively different here. And I think I don't know what exactly it is. I don't know. I'm going off of a hunch here, but things have really has sort of they have taken a turn.
It
Um,
feels different. You're on the ground. You're in New York City,
yeah.
where this monster's home, but also that has renounced him and that he's renounced, right?
Yeah, but we have this mayor, I don't know if you've been following, but we have a mayor who's completely um kind of strangled and willfully so by the administration and is probably going to just do whatever they want, right? They've really got him in
Yeah, I
a
mean,
vulnerable
for people
position.
listening, this is a former police chief who's now the mayor, who's nominally a Democrat, but who is under examination, let's say, for numerous forms of corruption.
For taking a bribe from Turkish officials uh, for to open an embassy quicker. I mean, really tin pot stuff. It's really
Right.
ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, is it different? Is it more of the same? It's more of the same and it's different. I think we can
Mm.
have it both can be true.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. And for those of us who are US citizens living abroad, it's a horrifying moment. And moving to Mexico, as I am tomorrow, of course, people there are horrified and terrified by what's likely to happen, both in terms of families, but also in economic terms.
Yeah, yeah. These tariffs may or may not be, I don't know. They keep changing their mind too. So it's really hard to, you know what it is? It's just really hard to think more than a couple days ahead. And that's been the case since COVID, right? Because you don't know if you can make a plan, you don't know if you're going to test positive. But that hasn't gone away. This feeling of like not knowing what lies ahead, even in the medium or short term. And I was telling a friend about this feeling, and he was like, Tusa, that's just what it's like to not have a future. And I was like, oh, okay. Maybe you're onto something here.
Can I know you've got a school run or a
Yeah.
run or whatever to do. Can I ask what ages your children are?
Yeah, they're almost 3 and almost 5.
Okay, exciting ages, really exciting
Really
both.
fun.
So we're sort of walking and sort of and talking and things like that.
We are walking and talking and never shutting up.
What what are your fears and hopes as a parent in terms of, pardon me, everything from artificial intelligence to Trump to the so-called breakup of the world order?
hmm Well, my like immediate fear, I guess, is like probably just because I'm neurotic, but like I'm convinced we're always being poisoned. So by something unseen and unsmellable and unseeable. So there's that. And you have small kids, they put everything in their mouth, like, oh my God, what is this?
Yeah, yeah, yep,
Microplastics, all this stuff. That's
yep.
drives me a little up the wall. But I am trying to prepare them for a future where they can go somewhere else. And applying for their foreign passports is one part of that.
Yeah.
Trying to make sure they speak another. I'm speaking to them in French. I'm bending over backwards to send them to schools that are bilingual. So I know this is like an unbelievably privileged position to be in, but that's kind of what I'm bracing myself for because I don't know what the future is going to be like for them here. And I want them to be in a place that's at the very least peaceful and like healthy and,
I
you
mean,
know,
this is one of the ironies that people like Macron and Starmer are our heroes right now.
yeah, I know it's bleak.
Astonishing. It's like when Merkel was a heroine for bringing in Syrian refugees. No, I appreciate your frankness very much, Atusha. I really do, because of course one has to acknowledge the privilege one does or doesn't have. But it's also important to recognize the material circumstances of being a loving mother and wanting to make sure that the best is available for the future. And I think every
Yeah,
parent is thinking about that now.
yeah, definitely.
And I don't know, I know we have to cut it off now. I hope you write about some of that stuff.
Okay, noted.
Because as you know, the big problem with journalists, great on everything except themselves. There's the mythology of the new journalism where you put yourself into the story. But actually, I think people have removed themselves more and more. They might be writing about the moment. So, for example, your profile in The Guardian of the old leftist, you're there and you acknowledge that. But other than that moment of being present, we don't learn enough about the great writers and researchers like yourself and many others that are there doing the work of trying to share with us what's really happening.
Well, that's really kind. Thanks for that push. Maybe I will.
I hope so. But it's up to you and your editors, and we await with great interest future pieces in, I don't know, New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, The Nation,
Yep,
and
all of the above.
forthcoming volumes. That'll be great. Thank you so much for speaking with us
My
too.
pleasure, Toby. Take care. Good luck with your move. Bye.
Cheers. Happy days.